Again, hello and welcome to this discussion about developer productivity and internal developer tools at Stripe. Just to add some context, Bunnyshell builds a SaaS platform for managing environments. It's focused on improving both the productivity and the developer experience for software engineers. And Stripe doesn't really need an introduction, I think. I'm Sorin, I lead the engineering team at Bunnyshell, and together with me is Horia, engineering site lead at Stripe. Horia, a few words about you, maybe?
Hello, everybody. Really nice to be here. I'm also an engineer. I'm an engineering manager, and I presently lead the Stripe Romania engineering team and helping to build out the site. Before this, I've been with both as a manager and an engineer, and I kind of led a bunch of platform and also infrastructure teams there. And before that, I worked for Stack Overflow and Google. So I've stayed, I would say, near to this area of developer productivity and building tools for developers and caring about the general developer experience for a while. So I'm really excited to speak about this topic today in front of you all and with Sorin from Bunnyshell too.
Great. Thank you, Horia. So let's see what we have on the agenda for today. So as soon as I finish introducing this, I'll hand it over to Horia. He'll be talking a bit about the philosophy at Stripe, how their teams are structured, and how the impact is created. And then move into the standardization and all the handy tools that they use. We're gonna close up with some insights and with a very short few minutes demo about Bunnyshell. And then, of course, we'll take some questions. So, Horia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the overview. Now, I think it is fitting to start with this chapter on philosophy in this very high-level chapter. So the story of Stripe, if you will, as much as I understand it, because it was 15 years ago, so a really, really long time, goes something like this. So the founders were trying to build some other business, and they were trying to accept payments online, but it turned out it was super hard to do that back in the day, and they spent more time doing this than anything else, actually. So they figured, perhaps this is the problem we should actually be solving, because there must be other people that are having this problem, and it's one that seems really hard and really useful for folks to solve. So they built a product to explicitly solve this problem for companies at the start of their career, like startups and very small businesses, and kind of try to service this part of the market, whereas everybody else was focused on the bigger players that had a lot of engineering teams, etc. So the selling point there, because the founders were quite technical, was that the product itself was very easy to integrate with and generally had a great user experience, where user here is the developer. So you had very small number of lines of code, and you did this API integration that was very simple and very well documented. And to this day, that's kind of our biggest differentiator across a lot of other areas of our product, that the integration surface is really nice and we're really well taken care of. And in the meantime, the company has grown, and it is now a integral part of the financial infrastructure of the world, and processes on the order of $1 trillion every year. But then if you translate that into kind of developer metrics, you see that we're doing something like 1.5 billion API requests in a day. The number might not sound that much, but a lot of these are actually writes. So each API call that you're doing is really important. Somebody might be transferring either buying a coffee, or they might be transferring like $100 million from one place to another. So they get a lot more scrutiny in that sense. And of course, there's a lot of newer APIs besides just the payment ones, and a lot of versions that kind of get changed through the year. So across time, if you will, and across all of our product lines, we really cared about the quality of the product that we were building. We cared about how you interacted with it, about being close to the users and building something that made sense for them and that was open and interesting to them. And the way you kind of build this, and to tie it up with the discussion that we have today, is essentially you can't build such a nice externally facing developer experience if your internally facing developer experience isn't great as well. So internally, you actually see a lot of people care really deeply about the work that they're doing for other developers. And there are for sure a lot of standards, a lot of committees to make sure that the external stuff makes sense and that it's great. But there's a lot of people as well that are working inside to make all of this stuff nice. And we're going to cover a bunch of this stuff as well during the seminar, kind of the tools that we have, the approaches that we have. We're going to zoom in into a bunch of them, especially around standardization and the value of it for large organization. But the root of it, and let's say the cause of all of this stuff, is that we care about this stuff in order to care about the external stuff too. So we can't build a really nice product for this sort of audience, like a very technical audience, and kind of have your house in order. It's for sure not the case that the cobbler's kids don't have shoes. How we achieve this stuff is actually, if you look at the whole of Stripe engineering, so there's about 2,000 plus engineers overall. And then this is out of a total of 7,000 employees. So engineering is a big part of the whole organization. And inside this, there is let's call it an infrastructure team. And it's a pretty big organization. It's about 500 people. And its mission, if you will, is to build a platform for the rest of the company, the rest of the developers to use and build their stuff on. And if you're familiar with something like Google App Engine or Heroku or Vercel or any of these new very high-level systems that just present to you a very opinionated interface, and you just code against it, and then you get everything for free, from deploys to environments to CI/CD. And that's what we're aiming for internally to build, just using more, let's say, baseline technologies such as AWS and Kubernetes and all of that stuff. So inside this really, really big team, there is another team that does developer experience. And this is about 150 people that just work on programming language tooling, on CI/CD, on developer environments, on the various libraries and frameworks that we have developed in-house to build all of this software. And if you think about it, 150 people out of 2,000, that's quite a large number, like quite a large dedication to developer productivity from the organization. I remember in my last place, from a company of, let's say, about 1,000 developers, we had half a person dedicated to this topic. It just wasn't as big of a priority there as it is here. But I would say, besides feeling good about ourselves and being like super philosophical, we actually have a lot of data to show that if we do this stuff, then it's actually a net multiplier for the company. So on the one hand, we are tracking things in the company around how fast developers are moving, how many releases they can do, how much stuff they can push out to production, what issues they're facing when they're doing that. And this gives us a measure of, when we're doing the various bits of work that we're doing, if we are improving this stuff, we can actually translate it very well into business impact. So this issue that you see in a lot of teams like this, a lot of efforts like this, where developers kind of know this is the right thing to do, but they have trouble articulating it in a way that the rest of the organization understands, doesn't exist as much here, because you can, at this scale, if you can translate it into meaningful improvements into the bottom line, or into efficiency, or just into the lives of developers. So we're doing all of that stuff, and there's of course efficiency work and all of those standard keeping the lights on type things that you do. But we are also looking at more, let's say, holistic views of, do developers feel that they are being productive at Stripe? And this is a broader trend that's happening now in the industry under the umbrella of developer experience, where folks are starting to look at this thing from a, even if you're familiar with pulse surveys and all of that, approach to getting the overview of how your organization is doing from various axes. People are applying the same techniques in developer productivity and asking developers essentially, do you feel that you are productive as a developer? Do you feel that you have enough focus time? Do you feel that you have too many interruptions, or that you know what you're supposed to be doing and all of this stuff? And we're tracking all of these things and through the developer productivity team. And we're also looking at the improvements that we're doing to see if they affect any of these changes. So you can see this graph over here, which sort of shows you a history quarter by quarter of how things have started from sort of an okay place. Then they really went downhill, and then they gradually improved as we started looking more and more into giving developers focus time, making them be productive, reducing the number of meetings that they're going to, and being very kind of on it, if you will, with this thing. And the developer productivity teams had a crucial role here, because at this size of an organization, you can't really be manual about it. So we built a lot of tooling here just to enable this stuff to happen automatically, to automate a lot of the processes, to just cancel random meetings, to find focus time in your calendar, just focus on this thing. So we got it actually to be so good that we don't consider it a big problem anymore. It's not perfect by any means, because it never can be, but it's not a big problem anymore. And now the team is focusing on on-call load and reducing that and making it work. So there's a lot of stuff there that this team is doing, and that is kind of expanding the scope and increasing essentially the leverage you have with each engineer. And perhaps the biggest leverage point that we have here is standardization. So this is, if you will, a sort of double-edged sword that we encounter. So at Stripe, we have a very limited set of technologies that we're using. So we have, as I mentioned, 2,000 plus engineers, which means about 400 teams, give or take, and but each of them is using essentially the same stack. So if you are very front-end focused, you're going to be on React and TypeScript and a bunch of our own frameworks for micro front ends and component libraries. If you're on the services side, you're going to have Ruby or Java or perhaps a bit of Go. And then if you're even more on the data analytics side, it's going to be Java or Scala or Python realistically. So the whole data processing stack that people are using. And then storage and other libraries are pretty common. So it's Mongo and Postgres and Redis and Elasticsearch. And essentially the greatest hits you would find everywhere. Perhaps just Ruby and Mongo are the sort of more exotic choices that you would essentially see as very popular 15 years ago and that the company adopted, but then kind of the industry sort of moved on from them. We're still using them, but they're very different from the traditional versions. They have types and they have indices and schemas and all of that stuff that you wouldn't essentially associate with them, because they're operating at a really large scale right now. And it's a very conscious choice to be this control. Everything is in mono repos, and there's a big plan to shift things to a single mono repo in the future. But you kind of get standardization. So each project essentially looks the same, uses the same frameworks, uses the same libraries and the same versions of the libraries that everybody else uses. So on the one hand, you get a lot of firepower from your developer infrastructure teams, because they can assume everybody's on the same thing. So whenever they're doing a migration, they can do it for everybody. Wherever they're doing an upgrade, they can do it for everybody in a very easy fashion. They can assume a lot about the shape of the code as well. So it enables a lot of code generation to happen and a lot of kind of higher level abstractions to be used, even on transforming the code base that you couldn't really do if you had very heterogeneous code bases. And of course, it's an advantage, let's say, for developers, because essentially you learn this thing once, you learn the tech stack once, and then whenever you're moving projects, you just have to learn the new business logic, or just perhaps a technology that you are not so familiar with from the common stack, but you don't really have to start over from scratch. So it all allows a lot of organizational leverage, if you will, if you're doing this stuff, because you can just assume, the language is going to be Ruby. You can just assume the library is going to be this, it's going to be that. So of course has the downside that essentially, if you're not always using the right tool for the job, and you're not kind of maximizing the skill set of the developers that you are employing, or the engineers that are working on this code base, because they might be experts in another technology. But overall, I've seen it here and at other places that it definitely acts as a force multiplier for this sort of large scale engineering that needs to happen. And you also, let's say, based on that, you have a suite of other tools. There's a bunch of stuff that's highlighted here. So on the right-hand side, you can see something called Trailhead, which is a sort of tool for internal documentation that we wrote that's based on the tool for external documentation that everybody externally using Stripe uses. And that has a lot of extra and nicer features to write documentation for our purposes. So documents expire, you have to refresh them. It has a lot of integrations with other tools that it can kind of assume exist and operate in the same way, and assume there's a set of themes and all of that stuff that essentially work the way you would expect. And then on the left-hand side, you can see just some graphs for Prometheus monitoring that are auto-generated and based on the patterns you see in the code and the same structure that everybody's using. So you get a lot of this free lunch type monitoring for free, or alerting or logging or what have you in this setup. So it provides a lot of the stuff that can be done automated, takes care of a lot of the issues for you. It also, let's say, kind of to tie and make it a bit more specific, it also makes some other things hard. So I mentioned that we have mono repos, essentially. So they can get pretty big. Our main mono repo is about 30+ million lines of code, and the others aren't slouches either. So it's quite hard for local tooling to actually work with that. Even code navigation is difficult when you have projects that are this big, and builds and tests and all of that are kind of quite intense endeavors. So this is, let's say, the downside you're having with standardization and trying to keep everything the same when you're getting too big. Like it does get too big, it does get too hairy. So you have to build special tooling and special infrastructure just to handle your interesting case in that way. I believe you always have to build something. So even if you go the more non-standard way and everybody kind of does their own thing, you still have to do something. So you're paying a price, whether you like it or not. It's just, where are you paying the price? That's the difference. But this one is particularly heavier because it does run into some like very real limitations. Like you can only run so much code on a single machine. They're usually MacBooks, so they're not like super massive desktops or anything like that. And even with M1s and with a lot of memory, you can only do so much. So fairly, 4 or 5 years ago, we started moving a lot of our development in cloud on something we call dev boxes. So nowadays, to kind of cut a long story short, you don't really do local development. You just spin up some machine in the cloud, and then you edit remotely the files. You do all of your builds remotely, and they happen on a build farm, and you run your tests there, and everything looks like it's happening locally. But then you kind of do all of the stuff in the cloud on a very big machine. And this also opens up space for preview environments, because if you're already in the cloud, you can also start all of your services and give other people access to those things. And you have just really nice development experience where you push something essentially to Git, and then it gets built, and then it gets deployed, and you can integrate it with various parts of the QA or pre-prod infrastructure, so you can actually test it with the real data and see it behave in a more realistic scenario. You can share it with your friends as well, with your product managers, and they can play with it, explore it, and kind of give feedback on it. And then you can have a much tighter development flow in that way. And it's the interesting thing is that it looks very, very local. So you don't really feel like you're doing something remote, unless of course the internet connection goes down, which it's kind of not so fun. But that's a bit on the power of standardization, that you're getting all of this stuff kind of builds on top of it and builds on top of it. And that's cool, you might say. Like there's a lot of this cool technology that we've built. A lot of it is custom, unfortunately, so it's even hard to open source. It's hard to actually see it unless you're kind of working here. It's one of the problems a lot of the big companies have. So we all know that Google or Facebook, they have a lot of great infrastructure, but it is all very tightly kind of coupled together, so it's very hard to export it. And there's a famous case of Kubernetes that kind of had to be started again from scratch and not have any dependency on Google, because they couldn't actually get it out of the Google code base, even though the product kind of does the same thing. So if you're a smaller company, I would say there are a bunch of insights that you can gather out of this stuff. So first of all, there's value in standardization, and there's even a great talk that I recommend, which is called Use Boring Technology. So a lot of the places I've worked actually used quite a lot of boring and basic technology, but they pushed it to the max. And modern technology can absolutely be pushed to a really high max before it breaks. And Stripe is no different in this regard. We have very few things that are kind of new. They might be exotic, but they're not necessarily new. So definitely, if you apply that stuff in your own startup, your own small company, it's a nice and winning combination that gives you a lot of firepower for what you're paying. And the other thing is that since a company is smaller, it has a lot less complexity bound just in the infrastructure. So moving faster is much simpler. So I like to give this example of my side project that, I'm working in my spare time, and it's mostly like for myself and a labor of love. And here I have like the fanciest testing. I have per branch environments. I have a lot of the great stuff that in a lot of other places that I've worked, we didn't have, like, because they were just adding them was such a big lift and such a big kind of adder of complexity. They were massive projects, and in the end, we chose not to do them. But in your own smaller setup, you can actually do them. And nowadays, there's a lot of extra kind of suppliers here, and a lot of ready-made solutions that you can actually buy off the shelves, and that they have all of the integrations that you want. So you don't actually have to build a lot of this stuff yourself. You can just use something much polished, if you will. And I saw this in a bunch of companies where I worked, that there was an internal version that was perhaps a prototype of some external version, and the external version was much more polished and a much nicer product to use. And I wished I was using the external product rather than the original internal product that was just an internal tool and not that polished. Anyway, that's, I would say, the main message I had around this stuff. I tried compressing it a bit just to be wary of the limited time we have now. I'm going to hand it over now to Sorin for some talk on Bunnyshell.
Yes, thank you, Horia. So as Horia mentioned, there are platforms, ready-made solutions, which are starting to emerge. And these are actually very good choices for smaller teams that don't have the internal bandwidth to really build a platform, which may take years even for large companies. So this is the moment I'd like to introduce Bunnyshell and one of the features that we offer. Bunnyshell is an environment as a service platform, which essentially allows software developers to easily create and manage their environments, to edit configurations, to delete environments, and so on. So basically, you have a configuration which is already made, and you have some templates which can be used to spin up very easily environments within minutes. This can be done either by using an integration which is provided out of the box. Basically, you just connect your Git integration and that's it. And the environments themselves are technology agnostic. So they can be anything from modern deployments using Helm charts or Kubernetes manifests, to Docker Compose and just deploying Docker images, and even the most basic bash scripts deployed on virtual machines that you can create automatically with Terraform. So very quickly, I'm gonna take the share screen and try to do it. Okay, so this is it. Hope you can see my screen. So this is Bunnyshell. This is our platform. These are some environments which I have created in my project. I'm gonna head off to GitHub now and have a pull request created. So I have a very small change in a branch name, change one, very inspirational, I know. It's pointing toward the master, and I'm gonna create a pull request. There have some pull requests that have been created before, so this is why the above part appears. The point is that I just opened up a pull request, and if I go into Bunnyshell, I can see that I have this newly created environment which just started to be deployed. This is an environment which was created due to the pull request I just opened, PR18, and it was opened because on this environment, which is the base environment, I have a setting toggled to on. So for ephemeral environments, basically, this is the setting which says that new environments will be created out of this base environment for each pull request, and they will also be automatically deployed on this cluster. So speaking of which, you can have multiple clusters connected in Bunnyshell. I'm meaning Kubernetes clusters. You can have the major cloud providers, and you can also have custom clusters. Basically, a cluster which is accessible by the Bunnyshell platform, you can integrate and you can have deployments done there. So this deployment is in progress. Let me refresh the PR page. So this is how it would look like for an engineer who just opened up a pull request. During the deployment, they would see this comment here, and they would be able to go and see the actual environment. And they would also be able to go in and see the pipeline logs, the deployment logs, real time. So we can see that for this environment, this is a fairly simple environment. It contains the front end, the back end, and the database, a Postgres database. And the pipeline was generated for me by Bunnyshell. I'll get to how the environment was declared in a bit. You can see the build logs and the deployment logs real time. So you can definitely see the Docker build logs here in case something crashes or takes too long. You can definitely debug that. And in a minute or so, the environment will also be deployed. In the meantime, let me show you the configuration. So I mentioned the fact that the pipeline is generated by Bunnyshell. The environment is configured in a descriptive manner, so you only tell Bunnyshell what you would like to end up with. No, it's not imperative. You do not declare step by step the deployment or how it should be done. And this is an environment based out of Docker Compose components. You can see here an application, you have the Git coordinates, and then you have Docker Compose compatible syntax. This can be generated if you have a Docker Compose, you just import it into Bunnyshell and this environment definition will be generated. Besides Docker Compose properties, you just have the host, which is exposed publicly. And for databases, for example, you have persistent volumes. Of course, you want to keep the data if you stop the environment and then you start it again. So this is more or less how an environment is configured in Bunnyshell. Let's also see it in action. So this is the demo application I was mentioning. We have Stripe demo book, let's say, Stripe. Added it, it's there, it's persistent, it's stored in the Postgres database. So this is the environment, and I can also see the real-time logs. Here, if you go to the deployment, you can see the container logs, which are outputted in real time. You can search them, you can spot errors this way, and no need for any access to the Kubernetes cluster or to the underlying infrastructure. So this is totally decoupled from having privileges in the infrastructure. You can see here the logs being accessed. That was the access log. So if we refresh this page, you can see that the engineers would have in the PR as well all the info that they need. Still, the environment details and pipeline logs. They can also open this application directly from here, so no need to actually enter Bunnyshell to have the application tested. And a very cool feature, and also useful, not just cool, you can control the environment from a comment. So I just replied to this comment posted by Bunnyshell with a BNS stop comment, which will ultimately trigger an event that will stop my environment. You can see it's stopping here. So a new pipeline is being executed to stop the components. And basically what happens is that the application will no longer be accessible. The resources consumed by this environment will be freed up, except the volumes, of course. So the CPU and the memory will be freed up, and this leads to a very efficient usage on the cluster. So resources are used wisely. And my comment was updated. I can also start it from here or delete it from here. But because I also have another setting set to on, whenever I close the pull request, the environment will get deleted. And you can see here that the environment is currently deleting. This only happens because I have here in this original environment, besides this toggle of creating environments on pull request, I also have destroy environment whenever the pull request is either closed or merged. You can, of course, configure this, and you can also have the environments controlled by GitHub Actions or any other kind of pipelines in case you need a higher degree of control or what happens, or adding extra conditions, I don't know, to environment creation, for example. So the last thing I'd like to point out is that Bunnyshell supports templates. These are stored in Git repositories. A template is essentially a Bunnyshell YAML, which we saw earlier, together with some metadata file to render this documentation here. And it's very easy to also create environments on the fly, on demand, whenever you need one, just to test out something. You can deploy them, and that's really it. So now I will have another environment deployed, which is totally sandboxed from the others. This is how deployments work in Bunnyshell. Let's see if we have any questions. So moving forward to the last part of our webinar, I'm going to ask you to post any questions that you may have in the comment section on LinkedIn. And in the meantime, I would ask you, Horia, how do you see the internal developer platform, the concept evolving in the following years?
I would say it is a area of investment. Like we've seen it in the last 3 or 4 years that folks have started speaking a lot more about developer experience and developer productivity as they've realized that you can get essentially, perhaps broadly, as a lot of companies have realized, they are tech companies that are doing other things as well. And we see this wave of kind of technology sweep over a lot of industries. And then developers start having a much more central role in these organizations. The notion of developer productivity from all aspects, from the technology that they're using to how they're using it to, if you will, how they're spending their time has become that much more important. And it makes sense from, let's say, our point of view, because we know that's the case. Many times it makes sense from the business's point of view, because developers are going to be some of the most highly paid and most expensive people in the organization. If you hire them, you want them to be extremely productive. You don't want them to have a lot of friction. You don't want to have them a lot of bad experiences and just wasted time. You want them to do their job really, really well. And in order to do that, you're going to have a developer experience team that builds this developer platform for them, whatever form that might take. I would say for most, it is sort of services plus front end plus a data stack that kind of needs to exist under the ownership of this platform and be guided and built. If you want to be even more holistic here, you can even see it that as organizations become larger, you are building platforms, the top platforms that people are using. So you have somebody at the very top layer that are building just the product and all of the parts that are consumer facing. And then below that, you have various teams that are doing from communication services to mapping services to infrastructure to customer support to various higher and lower levels of this platform that they're handling in a platform way. And at the bottom of that, of course, you have your infrastructure teams, your developer platforms, and people that are building the tools that everybody else is using. They're kind of all stacked up on top of one another, building platforms for others and just exposing this very high level interface that they can then code on and adapting the previous layer from Amazon, from Google, from Azure, and transforming it into something higher level.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to also add my take on this from a smaller scale perspective. Let's say smaller companies with maybe a few tens of engineers, which don't really have the bandwidth to build this. I think that the complexity has risen a lot in the last maybe 10 years, and it's only continuously doing so. So when it comes to developer portals, the cat's clearly out of the bag, and there's no way this is not happening. It's something that will happen and will gain more and more adoption along even small companies as the barrier of entry gets lower and lower. And I think that the classical internal developer platform may not be as internal for small and mid-sized businesses, or even for large businesses that are not technology oriented. So if you're not a technology company, even if you have like a large development team, probably you will choose to buy something rather than build something and have the focus divided.
I would even say you can cut history in-house somehow. Like there was this very foundational layer in this technology world that started from, let's say early 2000s with this whole wave of Google and Facebook and all of that were the first hyperscalers in building a lot of this technology. And for better or worse, they had to build all of that in-house. But then after that, everybody has been benefiting from that and using something that's productionized in a way and that operates as a product. And even at Stripe right now, we do have some of the stuff that's built in-house and some of the stuff where we just said, no, we need a vendor to build something like this as a product rather than us hacking it together. And I think to your point, there's also a discussion on actual total cost of ownership, because as I mentioned, developers many times are going to be the most expensive people in the organization. If you have, 20 of them, you absolutely want to have them working on the main thing, not on CI/CD pipelines, or you're kind of reinventing a tool that already exists. And then if you factor that sort of cost into the equation, you're having your vendor cost versus kind of getting some developers to build it. Like almost always, the answer is just buy it from a vendor. Only at the extremest of scales do you see that it makes sense to unbundle that and start building stuff yourselves. But that's a nice problem to have on the other hand. So
Yeah, very well pointed out. A good problem to have. So one more question. Can you discuss the role that leadership plays in the shaping of the development and adoption of internal tools at Stripe?
Yeah, so I would say this is an interesting thing, and it's also a place, having been in a number of companies, granted not a lot of companies, but enough to form a sample. I can definitely say that there is a difference in places where the founders or enough of the executive team comes from a technology background versus the cases where that's not the case. Because technology people will understand a lot more of the requests and demands of engineers than non-technology people. They will just understand them the same way, lawyers will understand better the problems of lawyers, or architects the problems of architects. So you do get extra just credit, if you will, by working in such an organization. And this is, if you're ever in the search for a job, if you will, this is a criteria to look out when you're selecting companies. Are the CEO or members of the executive team technology people? That means you're probably going to have an easier time with these sorts of asks, with things like migrations or enough budget for keeping the lights on work and all of this stuff. And then if not, it's probably going to be harder. Like you're going to need a really strong head of engineering or somebody like that to hold the fort. Otherwise, there's always going to be some product fire that needs covering, and some sort of short-term win that overrules any long-term work that developers want to do in that way. So that would be one aspect here that leadership can help with, even if it's not saying build this, build that, etc. In my time at Stripe, and kind of to answer your question, I have seen the leaders be quite involved in setting the direction of the organization. So for a team such as, let's say, a developer productivity team, what they would do is they would gather a lot of input from all of the stakeholders in the company, which means developers and managers and tech leads and people who have first-hand experience with this work, and they would kind of try to synthesize it into themes, into directions, try to tie it all together, and then together with their team give this shape of, for the next 1 or 2 quarters, this is what we're going to focus on. For the quarters after that, this is what we're going to focus on. And sometimes it's perhaps some migration from old technology to new technology. Other times it might be a focus on and improving efficiency across the board. Yet another time, it might be just a new technology that's being developed and it needs to be adopted. So it doesn't stay, let's say, the same forever. But this is how I see the role of a leader in this sort of organization, just scanning and then building patterns out of this stuff, and then giving the direction for the organization and being a bit more hands-on. And it's easier for this sort of work because engineers, they like this stuff by definition, and building for other engineers, it's usually, they're the nicest customers because they know exactly what they want. So you can speak at a very high level with these folks and kind of get a good direction. You don't need any translation from problem to solution space, if you will.
Yeah, thank you, Horia, for the detailed answer. Indeed, that's a very, very true story. And we've witnessed that firsthand here at Bunnyshell when building for developers. So I think the time is coming to an end. Can you share some challenges that you have currently in Stripe besides hiring people? I know that you are struggling with this lately.
Yeah, I would say there's always challenges. Hiring, yes, it is. I would say every company struggles to hire because every company wants to hire, the best people by whatever definition they have of the best. So we're joking that probably even OpenAI has trouble hiring because their pool of candidates is that much smaller, even though they are very well known globally. So everybody struggles. So, if you're on the lookout for a job, we are hiring and we're interested in the people who come to this sort of webinars for sure. But speaking of technology, if you will, there's always challenges. So it's interesting to compare places and see what things a certain company is struggling and other isn't, and vice versa. I would say one thing that I have found common is that you do tend to have a center of gravity in terms of technology, and that many times for companies such as this tends to be the back end, and that's where perhaps the founders had the most experience, or where a lot of the code are, or a lot of the more kind of seasoned engineers tend to be. So you get to the point where that's where most of the tooling exists and most of the processes, etc. And as you go further away from that, you don't see as much tooling. So if you go towards the front end, perhaps they don't have the same bells and whistles that the back end have. Or if you go towards data analytics, usually they don't have a good story about testing and data, and it's all like testing it in production. So one of the bigger challenges we're seeing right now is how do we bring all of these disparate areas of development to the same level, so you can actually have a really great and unified experience whatever you're doing, rather than just this really great experience on the services and a kind of meh experience on the other side. So that would be a nice challenge, and then one that I've seen kind of common, but I found it again at Stripe.
Great. Thank you for sharing. So if you're on a lookout for an engineering job, don't hesitate to contact Horia if you want to work at Stripe. Thank you for attending our webinar. I really hope that you got something useful from it. And we wish you a good evening or a good day ahead, depending on where you're at. Any last words, closing words, Horia?
Thank you very much for having me on this thing. It's been great talking about this stuff and learning about Bunnyshell. It's really nice seeing all of this cool technology that's being developed and all of the nice ways people have now of putting stuff in production. 10 years ago we had nothing, and now we have all of this like cool stuff that make it just a breeze to develop. So we best get to developing.
Okay, thank you. Have a good one, and see you at the next webinar.
Yep.
Bye.
Stay frosty, everybody. Cheers.